I was sitting on my porch in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, nursing a cold beer when I first saw her marching across my front lawn like she owned the place. The woman had that look about her, the one that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager," from 100 yards away. Her blonde hair was styled in that aggressive bob cut, and she clutched a leather binder against her chest like it contained nuclear launch codes. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you Gregory Garrison?" I set down my beer and stood up, already feeling my good mood evaporate. "That's me. Can I help you?" She stopped at the base of my porch steps, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "I'm Patricia Henderson, president of the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association. I need to discuss a serious violation with you. I had bought this house in Scottsdale 3 months ago, a nice 3-bedroom ranch with a decent yard in what seemed like a quiet neighborhood. The HOA had been mentioned during closing, but the documentation made it sound pretty standard. Maintain your lawn, don't paint your house neon pink, the usual stuff. "What violation?" I asked, genuinely confused. Patricia pointed a manicured finger at my roof. "That satellite dish. It's in direct violation of our community guidelines, Section 12, Paragraph 4. No external telecommunications equipment visible from the street." I glanced up at the dish I'd had installed just 2 weeks ago. I worked from home as a software consultant, and I needed reliable high-speed internet. The local cable company was a joke, with constant outages and speeds that barely qualified as broadband. The satellite service gave me the connection I needed to actually do my job. "I need that for work," I said. And I didn't see anything in the HOA docs about satellite dishes when I bought the place. Patricia's expression hardened. "Whether you saw it or not doesn't change the rules. The dish needs to come down within 7 days, or you'll face fines of $100 per day until it's removed." $100 a day? That's insane. "Those are the rules, Mr. Garrison. I didn't write them, but I am responsible for enforcing them." She opened her binder and pulled out a printed notice, handing it to me. "This is your official warning. 7 days. She turned and walked away before I could respond, her heels clicking on the sidewalk with each step. I looked down at the notice, reading through the dense legal language. Sure enough, there was a reference to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the Community Guidelines, along with the fine structure she'd mentioned. I went inside and dug out the HOA documentation I'd received at closing. It took me 20 minutes of searching through the 70-page document before I found the section she'd referenced. There it was, buried in the middle of a bunch of other architectural guidelines. No external antennas, satellite dishes, or telecommunications equipment visible from any public street or common area. "This is bullshit," I muttered to myself. The next morning, I called the satellite company to ask about the situation. The customer service representative listened to my story and then said something that caught my attention. "Sir, you might want to look into the FCC's OTARD rule. HOAs actually can't prevent you from installing a satellite dish in most cases." "The what rule, OTARD?" "Over-the-air reception devices. It's an FCC regulation that protects your right to install antennas and satellite dishes. Let me transfer you to our legal compliance department. They can explain it better." After a brief hold, a woman named Jennifer came on the line. She sounded like she'd dealt with this exact situation 1,000 times before. "Mr. Garrison, the FCC's OTARD rule, which has been in effect since 1996, protects your right to install satellite dishes and antennas on property you own or rent. HOAs can impose some restrictions, like requiring dishes to be installed in less visible locations if those locations still allow you to receive an acceptable quality signal. but they absolutely cannot ban them outright. So this fine they're threatening me with would likely be unenforceable. I'm going to email you some information about the OTARD rule, including the relevant FCC fact sheets and regulations. If your HOA continues to push this, you might want to file a complaint with the FCC. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and anger. Relief that I wasn't actually in the wrong, and anger that Patricia had come at me with such aggressive threats when she apparently didn't know what she was talking about. The email from Jennifer arrived within 10 minutes. I spent the next hour reading through everything she sent. The OTARD rule was clear. It applied to dishes up to 1 meter in diameter, which mine definitely was. It covered antennas used for television, internet, or other communication services. And it specifically stated that HOAs, condo associations, and landlords could not restrict installation in ways that prevented reception of an acceptable quality signal or imposed unreasonable costs. There were some nuances. The HOA could require the dish to be installed in a spot that wasn't visible from the street, but only if that spot still provided adequate signal quality. They could impose reasonable safety requirements, but an outright ban, that was illegal under federal law. I drafted an email to Patricia, attaching the FCC documentation and explaining that my satellite dish was protected under federal regulations. I kept it professional and factual, pointing out that the HOA's restriction violated the OTARD rule and that I would not be removing the dish. I hit send and waited. The response came the next day, but not from Patricia. Instead, I received a letter in my mailbox from the HOA's attorney, a guy named Marcus Webb. The letter was 3 pages of legal threats, claiming that I was in violation of the covenant and conditions I'd agreed to when I purchased the property, and that I would face immediate fines if I didn't comply. There was no mention of the OTARD rule or the FCC regulations I'd cited. I called a lawyer myself, a friend from college named David Chen who practiced in Phoenix. I explained the situation, and he actually laughed. "Greg, this is one of the most clear-cut cases I've ever heard. The OTARD rule completely supersedes their covenant restrictions. Federal law trumps HOA rules, period. So what do I do? Let me write a response to their attorney. I'll make it very clear that they are in violation of federal law and that if they continue with these threats, you'll file a complaint with the FCC and potentially pursue damages for harassment." Will that work? It should. Most HOA attorneys know about OTARD. This guy is either incompetent or thinks you don't know your rights. Either way, a strongly worded letter from an attorney should shut this down. David sent his letter the next day. I figured that would be the end of it, that the HOA would back down once they realized they were legally in the wrong. I was very, very mistaken. 3 days later, I came home from a meeting with a client to find a bright orange sticker plastered across my front door. It was a notice of violation, claiming I had failed to comply with HOA regulations, and that fines would begin accruing immediately. The sticker also stated that the HOA board would be holding a special hearing to discuss additional enforcement measures. I called David immediately. "They're not backing down," I said, my frustration clear in my voice. "Forward me a photo of that notice. This is getting into harassment territory." I sent him the photo and then went online to check my HOA account. Sure enough, they'd already added a $100 fine to my balance, with a note that additional fines would be assessed daily until the violation was corrected. "They're actually charging me," I told David when he called back. $100 just went onto my account. Don't pay it. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the FCC on your behalf. This is blatant violation of federal regulations, and the FCC takes this stuff seriously. The FCC complaint process turned out to be fairly straightforward. David helped me fill out the forms, documenting everything that had happened. The threatening letters, the fines, the orange sticker. We included copies of all the correspondence, photos of my satellite dish and its location, and detailed explanations of why the HOA's actions violated the OTARD rule. According to David, the FCC would investigate the complaint and could potentially fine the HOA or issue a cease and desist order. The process could take weeks or even months, but it was the right move. In the meantime, I had to deal with Patricia and her board. The special hearing she'd mentioned was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse. The notice I received said I was invited to attend to explain my continued violation of community standards. I showed up at 7 o'clock with David by my side. The clubhouse was a modest building with a meeting room that could hold maybe 50 people. There were about 15 residents in attendance, along with Patricia and 4 other board members seated at a table at the front of the room. Patricia's eyes narrowed when she saw David with me. "Mr. Garrison, this is a community hearing, not a legal proceeding. There's no need for attorneys." David smiled politely. "I'm here as Mr. Garrison's advisor. Unless you're planning to bar him from having representation, I'll be staying." Patricia looked like she'd bitten into a lemon, but she nodded curtly and gestured for us to sit. The hearing started with Patricia reading through a prepared statement about the importance of community standards and how individual homeowners needed to respect the collective agreement they'd made when joining the neighborhood. She made it sound like I was some kind of anarchist trying to tear down civilization. Then she turned her attention directly to me. "Mr. Garrison, you've been given multiple notices about your violation. You've refused to comply. The board has been patient, but that patience has limits. We need you to commit, right here and now, to removing that satellite dish within the next 48 hours. I stood up, and David handed me a folder containing printouts of all the FCC regulations and our correspondence with the HOA's attorney. "Mrs. Henderson, with all due respect, I'm not removing anything. My satellite dish is protected under federal law, specifically the FCC's OTARD rule. You've been provided with documentation explaining this. Your attorney has been provided with documentation explaining this. What you're doing right now is not just wrong, it's illegal." One of the other board members, a man in his 60s with a gray beard, spoke up. "Young man, we don't appreciate being lectured about the law. We have our own legal counsel." "Then your legal counsel should have told you that you cannot restrict satellite dishes under federal regulations," David interjected. "The OTARD rule has been in effect for nearly 30 years. This isn't new or controversial law. It's settled." Patricia's face was turning red. "This is our community, and we have rules. If everyone just decided which rules they wanted to follow, we'd have chaos." "Federal law isn't optional," I said. "You can't enforce a rule that violates federal regulations. If you continue trying to fine me or force me to remove my dish, I will pursue every legal remedy available, including filing a formal complaint with the FCC. In fact, I've already done that." The room went silent. Patricia and the other board members exchanged glances. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice ice cold. "This hearing is over. The board will deliberate and communicate our decision within 72 hours. David and I left, and I felt a small sense of victory. At least I'd made it clear that I wasn't backing down, but that feeling didn't last long. 2 days later, I received a letter from the HOA stating that my fines had been increased to $500 per day, for continued and willful violation of community standards. The letter also stated that if I didn't comply within 10 days, they would place a lien on my property. "Can they do that?" I asked David when I called him in a panic. "They can try, but any lien based on these fines would be invalid because the underlying fines are illegal. Still, liens can create serious problems, even invalid ones. They can complicate refinancing, sales, all sorts of things. We need to be aggressive here." David filed for a temporary restraining order in Maricopa County Superior Court, asking a judge to bar the HOA from assessing any further fines or placing a lien on my property. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, the daily fines kept piling up on my HOA account. After 5 days, the balance showed $3,500 in fines and penalties. It was completely absurd, but there it was in black and white. The day before the court hearing, something even more bizarre happened. I came home to find that someone had cut the cable running from my satellite dish to the junction box on the side of my house. The cable was sliced clean through, clearly done with some kind of tool. I was furious. This wasn't just bureaucratic harassment anymore. This was property damage, maybe even vandalism. I called the police and filed a report, then called my satellite company to get the cable replaced. The police officer who responded was a young guy named Officer Martinez. He took photos of the cut cable and wrote up a report, but he was honest about the reality of the situation. "Mr. Garrison, unless you have video evidence of who did this, it's going to be hard to pursue charges. Could have been anyone. You have any cameras?" "No, but I'm getting some installed immediately." "Good idea. In the meantime, I'll file this report. If it happens again and you have evidence, we can move forward with charges." I spent the rest of the evening installing a wireless camera system that covered my front yard, driveway, and the side of the house where the satellite equipment was located. The cameras had night vision and motion detection, and they uploaded footage directly to the cloud. If someone tried this again, I'd have proof. The court hearing the next day was surprisingly straightforward. David presented all our documentation to the judge, a middle-aged woman named Judge Andrea Thompson. He explained the OTARD rule, showed her the FCC regulations, and documented the increasingly aggressive actions the HOA had taken. The HOA's attorney, Marcus Webb, tried to argue that the covenant restrictions I'd agreed to when purchasing the property were binding, and that the HOA had the right to enforce them. Judge Thompson wasn't having it. "Counselor, are you seriously arguing that an HOA covenant can override federal regulations?" "Your Honor, we believe that property owners enter into these agreements voluntarily and should be bound by them." "That's not how federal law works, Mr. Webb. The FCC's OTARD rule is clear and has been upheld repeatedly in federal courts. Your client cannot enforce restrictions that violate federal law, period." She granted the temporary restraining order, barring the HOA from assessing any further fines related to the satellite dish, and prohibiting them from placing a lien on my property. She also ordered the HOA to suspend any existing fines pending resolution of the FCC complaint. It felt like a major victory, but Patricia apparently didn't see it that way. That evening, I received an email from her personally, not from the HOA's attorney. The email was unhinged, accusing me of trying to destroy the neighborhood, claiming I was setting a precedent that would lead to everyone installing ugly equipment all over their properties, and threatening that the HOA would use every tool at our disposal to maintain community standards. I forwarded the email to David with a simple message. "Is this harassment?" His response came within minutes. "Yes. Keep documenting everything. 2 days later, my cameras caught something interesting. At 2:30 in the morning, a dark SUV pulled up in front of my house. A figure got out, walked up to my satellite dish, and appeared to be examining it. The person was wearing a hoodie, and the night vision made it hard to identify them clearly, but the body language and build looked female. The person didn't do anything to the equipment, just looked at it for a couple of minutes before getting back in the SUV and driving away. I couldn't make out the license plate clearly, but I saved the footage and sent it to both David and Officer Martinez. "That's definitely suspicious," Officer Martinez said when I showed him the video at the police station. "But looking at someone's property isn't a crime. If they come back and damage anything, we'll have evidence of a pattern." Things escalated further the following week, when I received a notice that the HOA was calling for a special vote of all homeowners to amend the community covenants to strengthen restrictions on external equipment. The notice made it clear that this was a direct response to my satellite dish, referring to recent challenges to community standards by certain residents. I spent the next few days walking around the neighborhood, knocking on doors and talking to my neighbors. I wanted to explain my side of the story before Patricia could poison everyone against me. Most people were actually sympathetic. A lot of them had their own frustrations with the HOA, and several admitted that Patricia ran the board like her personal fiefdom. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who lived 3 houses down, was particularly blunt. "Patricia's been a pain in my backside for years. She once tried to fine me because my grass was a 1/4 inch too tall. A 1/4 inch. I measured it myself. She's on a power trip, and most of us are sick of it." Another neighbor, a woman named Susan, told me she'd wanted to install solar panels, but the HOA had blocked her. "They said it would be an eyesore, never mind that it would save me thousands on electricity." I ended up giving up because I couldn't afford to fight them. By the time the special meeting rolled around, I talked to probably 30 homeowners out of the roughly 150 in the neighborhood. A lot of them promised to vote against Patricia's proposed amendment. The meeting was held on a Wednesday evening, again at the clubhouse. This time, the room was packed. Easily 70 or 80 people showed up, which apparently was unprecedented for an HOA meeting. Patricia called the meeting to order and launched into a presentation about the proposed covenant amendment. She had charts and graphs showing how property values could be affected by visual blight from satellite dishes and antennas. She cited examples from other neighborhoods where uncontrolled external equipment had supposedly led to decreased home values. It was all nonsense, of course. There was no real data to back up her claims, just scare tactics. When it was time for community input, Frank stood up first. "Patricia, I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. In that time, property values have gone up steadily, and it's had nothing to do with whether people have satellite dishes. This whole thing is about control, not about protecting our investments." Susan spoke next. "I tried to install solar panels 2 years ago, and the board blocked me using the same section of the covenants you're trying to strengthen now. Maybe instead of giving the board more power, we should be limiting it." One by one, people stood up to voice their frustrations. It wasn't just about my satellite dish anymore. Years of petty enforcement, arbitrary decisions, and power trips were coming to the surface. Patricia tried to maintain control of the meeting, but it was clear she was losing the room. When it came time for the vote, the amendment was rejected by a margin of nearly 3-1. Patricia looked absolutely stunned. I don't think she'd ever faced that kind of repudiation before. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to shake my hand and thank me for standing up to the board. "You've done something most of us didn't have the guts to do," one man told me, but I knew Patricia wouldn't let this go. She was too invested, too committed to being right. Sure enough, 3 days after the failed vote, I received another letter from the HOA's attorney. This one claimed that regardless of the vote, the existing covenant still required removal of the satellite dish, and that the HOA would be pursuing legal action against me for breach of contract. David's response was swift and brutal. He filed a federal lawsuit on my behalf against the HOA, Patricia Henderson personally, and the HOA's attorney Marcus Webb. The lawsuit alleged violations of the FCC's OTARD rule, harassment, attempted extortion through illegal fines, and abuse of process. We asked for damages, attorney's fees, and an injunction preventing the HOA from any further enforcement actions related to the satellite dish. The lawsuit hit the HOA like a bomb. Within a week of filing, I learned through the neighborhood grapevine that 2 board members had resigned, apparently not wanting to be associated with the legal mess Patricia had created. The FCC also finally responded to my complaint. They sent a letter to the HOA explaining that their restrictions violated federal regulations and ordering them to cease all enforcement actions related to satellite dishes and antennas. The letter warned that continued violations could result in fines of up to $10,000 per violation. I thought surely this would be the end of it. The FCC had spoken. A judge had issued a restraining order. We'd filed a federal lawsuit. How much more could Patricia possibly take? But I underestimated her stubbornness, or maybe her detachment from reality. 2 weeks after the FCC letter, my cameras caught someone approaching my satellite dish again. This time, it was the middle of the afternoon, and the footage was crystal clear. Patricia Henderson herself, walking up to my dish with a pair of bolt cutters. I watched in real time on my phone as she attempted to cut the mounting bracket. The dish was mounted pretty securely, and she struggled with the bolt cutters for several minutes before giving up. But there was no question what she'd been trying to do. I immediately called the police and sent Officer Martinez the video footage. "That's destruction of property, attempted at least," he said. "We'll send someone to talk to her." 2 officers went to Patricia's house that afternoon. I wasn't there, but according to Frank, who saw the whole thing, Patricia initially denied being at my house. When the officers told her they had video evidence, she changed her story and claimed she was just inspecting the dish to see if it posed a safety hazard. The officers gave her a citation for attempted criminal damage and told her to stay away from my property. They also informed her that if there were any further incidents, she could face arrest. That evening, I got an angry phone call from another board member, a woman named Lisa who'd apparently taken over as interim president after Patricia's latest stunt. "Mr. Garrison, I want you to know that the board does not support Mrs. Henderson's recent actions. We're calling for an emergency election to remove her from her position." "I appreciate that," I said, "but honestly, at this point, I just want to be left alone." "I completely understand. The board will be meeting tomorrow to vote on suspending all enforcement actions related to your property pending resolution of the legal matters. I hope that provides some peace of mind." It did, somewhat, but the damage was done. I'd spent thousands on legal fees, dealt with months of stress and harassment, and had my property vandalized, all because Patricia couldn't accept that federal law superseded her HOA rules. The emergency election happened 2 weeks later. Patricia was removed from the board by an overwhelming vote. The new board president was Frank, the older gentleman who'd been one of my early supporters. His first act was to settle the federal lawsuit. The HOA agreed to pay my attorney's fees, remove all fines from my account, issue a formal apology, and update their covenant documentation to clearly reflect the OTARD rule protections. They also agreed to never again attempt to restrict satellite dishes or antennas except in compliance with federal regulations. Patricia, however, wasn't part of the settlement. Our lawsuit against her personally was still active, and David was pushing forward with it. She needs to face consequences for her actions, David told me. Not just the property damage attempt, but the harassment, the illegal fines, all of it. If we let her off the hook, she'll just do this to someone else down the road. The criminal case against Patricia for attempted property damage moved forward separately. The prosecutor's office charged her with criminal damage to property and harassment. It was a misdemeanor, but it was something. I had to testify at her trial, which happened about 6 months after the whole mess started. The courtroom was small, and there were only a handful of people in attendance. Patricia sat at the defense table with her attorney, refusing to make eye contact with me. The prosecution presented the video evidence, showing Patricia clearly attempting to cut my satellite dish mounting with bolt cutters. They also presented evidence of the cut cable from earlier, arguing that while they couldn't prove Patricia had done that, the pattern of behavior suggested she was responsible. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that she'd been acting in her official capacity as HOA president, enforcing community rules. The judge shut that down quickly. Miss Henderson wasn't enforcing anything, Judge Thompson said. She was attempting to destroy someone's property in violation of federal law. Her position in the HOA doesn't give her the right to take the law into her own hands. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Patricia guilty on both counts. The judge sentenced her to 6 months of probation, a $5,000 fine, and ordered her to pay restitution for the damaged cable and my security camera system. Our civil lawsuit against her settled shortly after the criminal verdict. Patricia agreed to pay $50,000 in damages and signed an agreement never to contact me or interfere with my property again. David told me we probably could have gotten more if we'd taken it to trial, but I was exhausted and just wanted it to be over. The whole ordeal lasted about 9 months from start to finish. 9 months of stress, legal battles, and dealing with someone who couldn't accept that she was wrong. But there was a silver lining. The neighborhood changed after Patricia was removed from the board. Frank and the new board took a much more reasonable approach to HOA governance. They focused on actual community needs like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, rather than nitpicking people's landscaping or architectural choices. Several other homeowners who'd been blocked from making improvements to their properties were able to move forward with their plans. Susan finally got her solar panels installed. Another neighbor put up a fence that the old board had rejected for arbitrary reasons. The community actually felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. As for me, my satellite dish stayed right where it was, delivering reliable high-speed internet for my work. Every time I looked up at it, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Not just because I'd won, but because standing up to Patricia had helped free the entire neighborhood from her tyranny. I learned a lot through the experience. I learned about the OTARD rule and FCC regulations, obviously. But I also learned about the importance of knowing your rights and not backing down when you're in the right. I learned that HOAs can be valuable when run properly, but dangerous when run by petty tyrants. And I learned that community solidarity matters. Without my neighbors supporting me, fighting Patricia would have been much harder. About a year after everything settled, I ran into Patricia at a grocery store in Scottsdale. She was in the produce section, examining avocados. For a moment, I considered just walking past her, avoiding any interaction, but something made me stop. Maybe curiosity, maybe a desire for closure. "Hello, Patricia," I said. She looked up, and for a moment I saw something flash across her face. Anger, maybe, or embarrassment. But then her expression settled into cold neutrality. "Mr. Garrison," she said curtly. "How are you doing?" I asked, genuinely curious. She set down the avocado she'd been holding. "I'm fine, living my life." "That's good." There was an awkward silence. Then Patricia spoke again, her voice quiet. "I suppose you think you won." "I don't think it was about winning or losing," I said. "It was about following the law. I was trying to protect the neighborhood, trying to maintain standards. That used to mean something. Standards are fine, Patricia. But they can't violate federal law, and they can't be enforced through harassment and intimidation." She looked like she wanted to argue, but something stopped her. Maybe the criminal conviction and the civil settlement had finally gotten through to her. Or maybe she was just tired of fighting. "I hope you're happy in the neighborhood," she said finally, then turned and walked away. I watched her go, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. I didn't hate Patricia. I actually felt a little sorry for her. She'd been so convinced she was right, so invested in her role as HOA president that she'd lost all perspective. It had cost her money, her reputation, and probably a lot of stress. But my sympathy only went so far. She'd made choices, and those choices had consequences. I finished my grocery shopping and drove home, pulling into my driveway and looking up at the satellite dish on my roof. It was just a piece of equipment, really. A small dish receiving signals from space so I could do my job and stream movies. But it represented something bigger. It represented the right to use your own property without unreasonable interference. The right to push back against arbitrary authority. The right to stand up for yourself when you know you're in the right. Frank came over that evening for a beer on the porch, something that had become a regular occurrence. We'd become good friends through all of this. "You know what the best part of all this is?" he said, settling into one of my patio chairs. "What's that?" "The new board is actually functional. We had a meeting last week, and it lasted 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Under Patricia, meetings would go for 3 hours while she lectured everyone about paint colors and mailbox styles." I laughed. "I'm glad something good came out of this mess. More than just something. You changed this whole neighborhood, Greg. People feel like they can actually enjoy their homes now without worrying that the HOA police are going to come after them for some made-up violation. I just wanted to keep my internet connection." "Yeah, but you stood up when a lot of people wouldn't have. That matters." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over the Arizona desert. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that reminded me why I'd moved to Phoenix in the first place. My phone buzzed with an email from David. The subject line read, "Final settlement payment received." Patricia had made her final payment on the civil settlement, $50,000 spread over 12 months. It was done. Completely, totally done. I showed Frank the email, and he raised his beer bottle. To justice, federal regulations, and the end of the Patricia Henderson era. I clinked my bottle against his. To all of that. The next few months were blissfully quiet. I worked from home, my satellite internet functioning perfectly. I got to know more of my neighbors, attended a few HOA meetings that were actually reasonable and productive, and generally settled into the life I'd hoped to have when I bought the house. The HOA even started a newsletter, featuring neighborhood news and upcoming events. One issue included a brief article about the OTARD rule, explaining to homeowners that they had the right to install satellite dishes and antennas under federal law, and that the HOA would work with residents to find installation locations that balanced aesthetic concerns with signal quality requirements. It was surreal seeing the HOA actually educate people about their rights instead of trying to suppress them. I also got involved in the community in ways I hadn't expected. I joined the board's architectural review committee, helping to review requests for home modifications. The role gave me insight into how the HOA actually functioned, and I was able to advocate for reasonable, lawful policies. When someone wanted to install a satellite dish, I made sure they knew about the OTARD rule and their rights. When someone wanted to paint their house a color that was technically against the covenants, I pushed the committee to consider whether the restriction was reasonable or just arbitrary. The HOA became what it was supposed to be: a tool for managing shared resources and maintaining the neighborhood, not a weapon for controlling people's private property. One evening, about 18 months after the whole satellite dish saga began, the neighborhood held a community barbecue in the common area park. It was a beautiful spring evening, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze. Families gathered, kids played on the playground, and people actually seemed happy to be there. Frank manned one of the grills, cooking burgers and hot dogs. Susan brought a potato salad that everyone raved about. I contributed a cooler full of beer and soda. At one point, Frank called for everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words," he announced. "When I became president of this HOA, I wasn't sure what I was getting into. But I knew we needed to change direction, to focus on building community instead of enforcing rules for the sake of enforcing rules." People nodded and murmured agreement. "We've come a long way," Frank continued. "We've updated our policies, we've become more transparent, and I think we've created a neighborhood where people actually want to live, not just a place where they are afraid of getting fined." There was applause at that. "I want to especially thank Greg Garrison," Frank said, gesturing to me. Greg stood up for his rights when it would have been easier to just give in. In doing that, he helped all of us. So thank you, Greg. More applause. I felt my face getting red, not used to being the center of attention like this. "Speech," someone called out. I shook my head, but people kept chanting, "Speech, speech." Finally, I stood up. Okay, I'll say something." The crowd quieted down. "When I bought my house here, I just wanted a nice place to live and work. I didn't want to become an HOA activist or fight a legal battle. But sometimes you don't get to choose your battles. Sometimes they choose you." People laughed at that. What I learned through all of this is that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And I learned that community isn't about following rules blindly. It's about people looking out for each other and respecting each other's rights. I raised my beer bottle. "So here's to Sunset Ridge. Not perfect, but getting better. And here's to all of you for being the kind of neighbors who make this place worth fighting for." Everyone raised their drinks and cheered. Later that night, after the barbecue wound down and I was walking back to my house, a younger couple stopped me. They'd moved in a few months ago, and I'd met them briefly at a previous HOA meeting. "Mr. Garrison," the woman said, "we just wanted to thank you. We almost didn't buy in this neighborhood because we heard horror stories about the HOA, but when we looked into it more and saw what had changed, we felt comfortable moving forward." "I'm glad it worked out," I said. "We have a baby on the way," her husband added. "We want to raise our family somewhere with a real sense of community. Somewhere where people stand up for what's right. This feels like that kind of place now." I shook his hand. "Congratulations on the baby, and welcome to the neighborhood." They walked off toward their house, and I continued to mine. When I got to my front porch, I turned and looked back at the neighborhood. Lights were on in houses up and down the street. I could hear the distant sound of laughter and conversation from the park. And there, on my roof, barely visible in the fading light, was my satellite dish. The thing that started it all. A small piece of technology that had somehow become the catalyst for changing an entire community. I thought about Patricia and wondered if she ever understood what had gone wrong. Probably not. Some people are too invested in being right to ever admit they were wrong. But I also thought about Frank, Susan, and all the neighbors who'd supported me. I thought about the young couple excited to start their family in the neighborhood. I thought about how a community could change when people decided they'd had enough of petty tyranny. My phone buzzed. It was an email from my satellite internet provider with my monthly bill. $239.88 for unlimited high-speed internet. The same service I'd been getting for the past year and a half without interruption. I did some quick math in my head. Over the course of this whole ordeal, Patricia and the HOA had threatened me with tens of thousands of dollars in fines. They'd spent who knows how much on legal fees fighting a battle they were destined to lose. Patricia personally had paid $50,000 in the civil settlement plus $5,000 in criminal fines, all over a dish that cost me less than $3,000 a year for service. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. I went inside and opened my laptop, checking my work email. I had a new project starting the next week, a major software development contract that would require constant video conferences and large file transfers. Without reliable high-speed internet, I never could have taken the job. My satellite dish wasn't just about principle or standing up to the HOA. It was about my livelihood, my ability to earn a living working from home. Patricia had never bothered to understand that. She'd seen it only as a violation of her rules, a challenge to her authority. That short-sightedness had cost her everything. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on my porch when I saw a satellite installation truck pull up 3 houses down. 2 technicians got out and started unloading equipment. I walked over out of curiosity. The homeowner, a man I'd seen around but never formally met, was standing in his driveway watching the installation. "Getting satellite service?" I asked. He turned and recognized me. "Greg Garrison, right?" "Yeah, I'm getting it installed today. The cable company's internet is garbage. I work from home and need something reliable." "Smart choice. You know about the OTARD rule," he nodded. "I talked to Frank before I scheduled the installation, just to make sure there wouldn't be any issues. He told me the whole story about what you went through, said I should thank you for paving the way." "Happy to help," I said. "Where are they putting the dish?" "On the back corner of the roof. The tech said the signal should be fine there and it won't be visible from the street." "Perfect. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. The HOA can request reasonable placement, but they can't stop you from getting service." We chatted for a few more minutes while the technicians worked. It felt good knowing that other homeowners could now get the services they needed without fear of HOA retaliation. Over the next few months, I noticed more satellite dishes appearing on houses throughout the neighborhood. Some were visible from the street, others tucked away on back roofs or side walls. The HOA didn't say a word about any of them. The whole culture had changed. Instead of looking for violations to punish, the board focused on actual community improvements. They repaved the streets in the common areas, updated the playground equipment in the park, and organized regular social events that brought neighbors together. Property values actually went up, despite Patricia's dire warnings about how satellite dishes would destroy our investments. Turns out that people value living in a community that respects their rights more than they value conformity for its own sake. I heard through the grapevine that Patricia had moved out of the neighborhood entirely about 6 months after her criminal conviction. She sold her house and relocated somewhere in northern Arizona, away from Scottsdale and the neighbors who'd rejected her leadership. Part of me felt bad about that. She'd lived in the neighborhood for years before I arrived, and in some ways, I'd driven her out. But I reminded myself that she'd made her own choices. I hadn't forced her to threaten illegal fines or attempt to destroy my property. Those were her decisions, and she had to live with the consequences. 2 years after I first installed my satellite dish, I got a call from a journalist at the Arizona Republic, the major newspaper in Phoenix. She was writing a story about HOA overreach and had come across court records related to my case. "Would you be willing to talk to me about your experience?" she asked. I agreed, and we met at a coffee shop in Scottsdale. I told her the whole story, from Patricia's first visit to my porch to the criminal trial and civil settlement. The journalist took detailed notes and asked insightful questions. "Your case isn't unique," she told me. "I've been researching this for months, and there are hundreds of similar stories across Arizona. HOAs wielding power they don't legally have, threatening homeowners with bogus fines, making life miserable for people who just want to use their property. What can be done about it?" I asked. "More people need to know their rights. The OTARD rule has been around since 1996, but most homeowners have no idea it exists. HOAs count on that ignorance. If more people stood up like you did, these abusive practices would stop." The article came out a few weeks later, running on the front page of the local section. It featured my story prominently, along with interviews with other homeowners who'd fought their HOAs on various issues. The journalist had done excellent work, clearly explaining the legal issues and calling out the pattern of HOA overreach. The story went viral locally, getting shared thousands of times on social media. I received emails and messages from people all over the state, thanking me for speaking out and asking for advice on their own HOA battles. I did what I could to help, forwarding people to the FCC website for information about OTARD, recommending David as an attorney for those who needed legal help, and generally encouraging people to stand up for their rights. One message particularly stuck with me. It was from a woman in Tucson who'd been threatened with fines for installing a satellite dish to get internet service for her disabled son's online schooling. The HOA backed down immediately after she cited my case and the OTARD rule. "You probably saved me thousands in legal fees and months of stress," she wrote. "Thank you for fighting your battle so people like me don't have to." That message made everything worthwhile. The stress, the legal fees, the months of dealing with Patricia's harassment. If my experience could help even one other person avoid that nightmare, it was worth it. 3 years after the whole saga began, I was invited to speak at a conference on property rights hosted by a Phoenix-based legal advocacy organization. The conference brought together attorneys, homeowners, HOA board members, and policymakers to discuss balancing community standards with individual rights. I gave a 30-minute presentation about my experience, walking through the timeline of events and explaining the OTARD rule and how it protected homeowner rights. The room was packed, with probably 200 people in attendance. During the question and answer session afterward, an older woman raised her hand. "Mr. Garrison, knowing what you know now, would you have handled anything differently?" I thought about it for a moment. Honestly, I wish I'd known about the OTARD rule before I ever installed the dish. If I'd been able to cite it right away when Patricia first approached me, maybe the whole conflict could have been avoided. But beyond that, no. I'd do the same things. Stand firm, document everything, get good legal advice, and don't back down when you know you're right. Another person asked, Do you think all HOAs are bad? Not at all, I said. HOAs serve important functions. They maintain common areas, organize community events, and can genuinely add value to neighborhoods. The problem is when HOAs are run by people more interested in control than community. When board members see themselves as enforcers rather than representatives, that's when you get abuses like what I experienced. A man in the back raised his hand. I'm on my HOA board, and I want to make sure we're not violating anyone's rights. What advice would you give to board members? Know the law, I said immediately. Educate yourselves about federal and state regulations that might supersede your covenants. The OTARD rule is a big one, but there are others. Solar panel protections in many states. ADR requirements for modifications needed for disabilities. When in doubt, consult with an attorney who specializes in HOA law, not just general real estate law. I continued, and remember that you're there to serve the community, not rule over it. The best HOAs I've seen focus on the things that truly affect everyone, shared spaces and genuine safety issues, not micromanaging paint colors or landscaping choices. Trust your neighbors to be adults who can manage their own properties. The conference was energizing, connecting me with people who were passionate about property rights and reasonable community governance. I exchanged contact information with several attorneys and advocates, building a network of resources I could point people to when they reached out for help. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. My work continued to go well, powered by reliable satellite internet. I stayed involved in the HOA board, serving on various committees and helping to ensure policies remained reasonable and lawful. I became friends with many of my neighbors, building the kind of community connections I'd hoped for when I first moved to Scottsdale. 4 years after installing my satellite dish, I got a letter from the FCC. They were doing a study on OTARD rule compliance and enforcement, and they wanted to include my case as an example of successful individual advocacy. They asked permission to reference my complaint and the outcome in their report to Congress. I agreed, of course. If my experience could help shape better policy or enforcement at the federal level, that seemed valuable. The FCC report came out 6 months later, and it was eye-opening. Thousands of OTARD complaints were filed every year, with many homeowners facing the same kinds of threats and harassment I'd experienced. The report recommended increased public education about the rule and stronger enforcement mechanisms for violations. I hoped it would lead to changes that would protect future homeowners from what I'd gone through. Around the same time, Frank decided to step down as HOA president. He'd served for 3 years, transforming the board's culture and operations, and he felt it was time for new leadership. A few neighbors approached me about running for the position. I was hesitant at first. Leading the HOA seemed like it would be a lot of work, and I had my own business to run, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I'd learned so much through my conflict with Patricia. I understood the importance of knowing the law, respecting homeowner rights, and building genuine community. Maybe I could use that experience to help keep the HOA on the right track. I ran for president and won easily. My first act in office was to organize a comprehensive review of all HOA covenants and rules, with the goal of identifying and removing any provisions that violated federal or state law. We found dozens of problems. Restrictions on solar panels that violated Arizona state law. Antenna restrictions that went beyond what OTARD allowed. Rules about religious displays that potentially violated First Amendment protections. We spent 6 months working with an attorney to revise the covenants, removing illegal restrictions and clarifying legitimate rules. When we were done, we had a set of governing documents that protected the community's interests without trampling on individual rights. We also implemented new procedures for enforcement. Any fine over $100 required a hearing with the full board, not just approval from the president. All enforcement decisions had to cite specific, legitimate rule violations with clear evidence. And we created an appeals process for homeowners who felt they'd been unfairly targeted. The changes weren't universally popular. A few old guard members complained that we were being too lenient, that standards were slipping. But the vast majority of homeowners appreciated the more balanced approach. Property values continued to rise. The neighborhood remained attractive and well-maintained. And people felt like they actually owned their homes, not just rented them from the HOA. 5 years after my satellite dish installation, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I was working in my front yard when a car pulled up and a woman got out. She was in her 30s, professionally dressed and carrying a tablet. "Mr. Garrison," she asked. "That's me. Can I help you? My name is Jennifer Martinez. I'm with the FCC's Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. I wanted to meet you in person if you had a few minutes." I wiped my hands on my jeans and invited her inside. We sat in my living room, and she pulled up some documents on her tablet. "Your case has become something of a touchstone for us," she said. "We use it in training for our enforcement staff as an example of how the OTARD rule is supposed to work. A homeowner knows their rights, documents violations, files a complaint, and we're able to intervene effectively." "I'm glad it's been useful," I said. "More than useful." "Your case helped inspire the public education campaign we launched last year. We've created fact sheets, videos, and other resources explaining the OTARD rule. Complaints are actually down because HOAs are being more careful and homeowners are more informed." She showed me some of the materials they'd developed. They were clear, accessible, and prominently featured real-world examples, including my situation. "We wanted to thank you personally for standing up for your rights," Jennifer said. "A lot of people would have just given in, taken down the dish, and lived with inadequate internet service. You fought back, and it's made a difference." After she left, I sat on my porch looking at my satellite dish. That simple piece of equipment had changed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. It had turned me into an advocate, an HOA president, and apparently an example used in federal training programs. But more than that, it had taught me the value of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it would be easier to just comply and move on. Because sometimes those fights matter, not just for you, but for everyone who comes after. As the sun set over Scottsdale, painting the sky in brilliant colors, I thought about Patricia and wondered if she'd learned anything from our conflict. I hoped so, but I'd never know. What I did know was that my neighborhood was better for what had happened. The HOA was fairer, more respectful of rights, more focused on genuine community building. Dozens of homeowners had satellite dishes and solar panels and other improvements that made their lives better. And my internet connection still worked perfectly, allowing me to do my job and live the life I wanted. Sometimes the smallest things lead to the biggest changes. A satellite dish protecting property rights and transforming a community. It seemed absurd when I said it like that, but it was absolutely true. I raised my beer bottle toward my roof, toward that satellite dish that had caused so much trouble and accomplished so much good. "Here's to federal regulations," I said to no one in particular, "and to standing up for yourself." The dish sat silently on my roof, receiving signals from satellites thousands of miles above Earth, completely unaware of the journey it had taken me on. And that was just fine with me.